Hey, it's Vanessa the Crafty Gemini, and I'm back with the final video here of my Tulipán Quilt Along. We're finally going to start piecing the blocks together, creating rows, making the quilt top, and I'm going to show you how to cut and attach your borders to finish off the quilt top. All right, moving right along. Here we are with our 20 completed Tulipán paper piece blocks. This takes a while for foundation paper piecing because each one has so many different components. But now that we're here, you should have 20 total, 10 of each, and we are going to start laying them out so that we can sew them together. I know a lot of you may be tempted to pull the paper off away at this point, but I like to wait until the centermost patchwork parts of the quilt are completed, they're stabilized, and they're all sewn together, and then we'll go through and rip off the paper. So for now, we're going to be alternating and creating a grid of 4 blocks across by 5 blocks down. We're starting black, red, black, red. You're going to do that for 5 rows down, but you're alternating on the next one. So the next one is going to be red, black, red, black. Okay? So you can start sewing these up together, and to do that, all we're going to do is sew this guy to here. And when we do that, remember that we left this additional chunk of paper here. That's our seam allowance. So when you sew, you should be sewing on this black line. That's your 1/4 inch, okay? So we're going to sew these two together. Then I'll go in and add this guy and this one to complete the first row. We'll repeat that alternating blocks like I'm showing you here for 5 rows down. So I'm going to get busy sewing, and I will meet you back here when I have at least the rows completed so we can speed this up a little bit more. All right, so we are done piecing the rows together. And so what I've done here is I've actually had to pin these up because since we still have the paper is not going to allow the fabric to stick to my design wall, which is simply a piece of batting. If it was a standalone block with just fabric, then it sticks onto the batting design wall really easily. For this, because it has paper, you may want to do something like this as well, where you pin it up so you can kind of see where you're going to line up the pieces, and that you also stop and make sure that you've pieced together the blocks for each row correctly. So again, we have 4 blocks across by 5 blocks down, and now we're going to go in and we're going to piece these together, making sure that we are being very careful when we sew these intersections. We want these to match up nicely right here where this row connects to the next one, because that's going to be a very prominent point in your quilt top, and you want to make sure to take the time and have some patience to try and make these line up as best as you can. So what I'm going to do is sew these rows together, and because this quilt top is not that large, you can just go ahead and sew each row together. On each one, every time you join a row to another, all you're going to have is 3 intersecting points. That's not that bad. And if your blocks are pretty precise, you shouldn't have too much of a problem getting these to come together. So I'm going to go ahead and sew my rows together exactly as I've placed them here, making sure I have alternating blocks everywhere I look. Looks good. And then I'll meet you back here once I piece together the entire quilt top. All right, so here is the Tulipán quilt top. I have 4 blocks across by 5 blocks down. And now the next thing you need to do is to add your borders to complete the quilt top. However, there's kind of 2 different things that you can do at this point. You can flip this over and start ripping off all the paper, or you can add the borders and then peel off the paper. So what I like to do, because the borders are not going to have any paper on them, we're simply going to cut the strips of fabric and attach them to all 4 sides of the quilt top. I like to go in now, and it's easy to just come in here and rip off the paper. If you did your foundation paper piecing with a thin enough sheet of paper, like newsprint that I used here, You could also use water-soluble paper. If you're using a thin water-soluble paper as your foundation, then you can obviously skip this step, because once you complete the quilt and wash it, then that paper foundation that you used, if it's water-soluble like that, it'll just disintegrate and wash out, okay? This is something that's fun to do when you're just sitting around watching TV. So we'll just go in here and peel off all the papers. So I'm going to continue to do this, and I'll meet you back here once all the paper has been removed and we are ready to cut our fabric and attach the borders. Alright, all the paper has been removed from the back, most of it. Any little teensy little bits, I don't think it's really worth the time to go in there and do that. If you use the thin paper, then it should just disintegrate in the wash. You just don't want to leave the majority of it on here if you're using the regular newsprint like I did. So let's go ahead and set this aside, and now we're going to move on to cutting out the border fabric so we can attach it next. Alright, so this is the print that I chose for the Tulipán quilt. I'm going to clean off this edge here just so I have a nice straight edge to start measuring my border strips from. For the borders, you're going to cut out strips that measure 2.5 inches wide. So they'll finish at 2 inches wide in the finished quilt top. So I've cleaned off the straight edge. I'll take a ruler here, measure 2.5 inches over. I always like to slide this little ruler to make sure that I'm maintaining that 2.5 inch measurement the entire length here, or the width of the fabric, I should say. So you're going to need 2 strips, because one's going to go on the top, another one for the bottom, and then one and one on the side. So you basically are going to cut out 4 strips by the width of the fabric, and they're all going to be 2.5 inches wide. And that's going to be enough to attach one to each of the 4 sides of your pieced quilt top. Here are my 4 strips. You won't have to piece any of these borders because the top is small enough that you can use just the solid strip that's cut on the width of the fabric. So now I'm just going to cut off the selvages. You need the full length for your borders, so just trim away just enough to get rid of the selvage. All right, now we take our quilt top, grab 1 strip at a time, and you're going to sew parallel sides. So if you sew one to the top, next I want you to sew one to the bottom of the quilt top, and then come back and attach one on the right and the left. Or you can also start off right and left, and then go back and attach top and right and bottom. All right? So we have some overage, so you can start it off further down, or you can line it up flush right on the edge. Your strip is longer than the quilt top, but you're basically going to put it right here with some pins, pretty sides touching, and you're going to sew just a long seam. Remember to do parallel sides, and then go back and do the other parallel side. So it's up to you, top and bottom, or left and right first. Go ahead and grab your strips, head over to the sewing machine, and I'm not even going to use pins, but if you're a newbie or you're a beginner, then definitely feel free to use some pins. All right, and after I sewed the first 2 borders on, parallel sides, okay, one on each side. In this case, I did the right and the left borders. I first press it just as it was sewn, then I'll come back in here, right? Just as it was sewn is like this. And then I come back in here, and I'll scoot this over so the border's on my left. And then I press it so that I'm pressing the seam allowance away from the patchwork. So then I carefully come in here and press the border flat. And then just repeat that to the other side as well. And then we're going to trim it flush with the quilt so we can add the remaining 2 borders. Now I grab a ruler, my rotary cutter, and line it up so it's a 90-degree angle from the border to the flush edge here of the quilt, and I know that I can trim away this excess and it's nice and square, so I'll do that on all 4 sides. Okay, now we'll head back to the sewing machine with our 2 remaining strips to sew one to the top and the other to the bottom. And when the last borders are attached, you're going to repeat the same thing you did for the first 2. Press it, then press it open, trim away, and your quilt top will be done. All right, and there you have it, the finished Tulipán quilt top. You can see it's not that big, so this is definitely a project that would be easy enough for you to tackle to quilt either by hand or on a domestic sewing machine. But at this point, it's up to you to finish off your quilt however you want to. You will need some batting and some backing fabric, and then also some fabric to bind all the layers of the quilt top once you're done. If you've never put together a quilt, I will link you in the description box below to a different series of videos where I give you tons of tips and tricks and show you some different options on how you can finish all your quilts. You could even hand tie this quilt if you didn't want to get into any actual machine quilting or little tiny stitches of hand quilting. You could just hand tie it, or you could do some bigger stitches in hand quilting it. If you were to tackle this on the machine, I would either go with just a basic all over design, or you can just do some stitching in the ditch. Because these blocks are quite small, typically the batting that you're buying, you want to make sure to read the manufacturer's instructions, and it'll tell you how far apart to have your quilting stitches if you're going to use that batting for a quilt. And most of the ones that I've seen on the market require at least 8 inches between quilting stitches. These blocks are smaller than that, so even if you just stitched in the ditch along these seam lines, you'd have plenty of quilting through your layers to keep the batting in place. So I hope you enjoyed this video series on how to make your Tulipán quilt top. Leave me a comment below if you're completing it, and definitely post pictures on social media and tag me using the hashtag CraftyGemini. Thanks again for watching this video, and I will see you all in the next one.